Hello my friends! Today we have another comparison video. This time we will be comparing two Sony cameras intended for hybrid shooting, the A7 Mark III and A6500. A7 Mark III is newer camera, it is more expensive and it is higher in the lineup, so this video will not be about trying to find out which one is better, but I will try to explain the main differences and I will try to provide you with necessary information so that you can decide which one should you buy or whether you should upgrade from your A6500 or A6300 to A7 Mark III. The improvements that A7 Mark III has over A6500 can be divided into categories. The first one is the improvement of the user experience and the second one is the improvement of the output and the performance. We will start with the build quality and handling. The build quality is very good on both feel very solid. Both cameras use magnesium frame, the coating is durable, the material on the grip has nice texture, so overall I have no complaints about the build quality, and I also like simplistic design of Sony mirrorless cameras. Both A7 Mark III and A6500 are still tiny for what they do. Sony in my opinion doesn't get enough credit for that. That is not necessarily true about the lenses, but I will talk about that in the separate video. A7 Mark III is of course significantly larger than A6500. A7 III is also SLR style body, whereas the A6500 is rangefinder style body. The grip feels better on A7 Mark III since it is deeper and longer, but the A6500 also has quite good grip for the size. But recently I have been using it with small rig L bracket base plate or cage, and that greatly improves the ergonomics, especially with larger lenses. But A7 III is still better in terms of the ergonomics overall. The A7 III is weather sealed, there are gaskets around the ports, but there is probably still a weak point on the bottom of the camera, but it should survive sensible amount of rain or snow. A6500 is dust and moisture resistant according to Sony, so there can be some protection, but I probably wouldn't take it on something like a rafting trip without additional protection. Regarding the handling, I can say that the A7 Mark III is a huge upgrade over A6500. Probably the most important improvement is that the A7 III has the joystick. It is very useful for moving the focus point and also for resetting it to the center. You can also use it to navigate the menu, and the reason why the joystick is especially important is that the use of touchscreen on Sony cameras is still very limited, so the joystick makes up for that a bit. A7 Mark III also has front dial and exposure compensation dial, which A6500 doesn't, and those also make the handling faster and easier, and there is also one extra custom button and the AEL button. The video recording button is also much better positioned on the A7 III, so I'm glad that Sony has fixed that. Both have viewfinders with 2.36 million dots resolution, but the A6500 has smaller 0.74 times magnification viewfinder, whereas the A7 Mark III has 0.78 times magnification viewfinder. The difference is actually quite significant, but both viewfinders are fine to use. Both are bright enough, but I certainly wouldn't mind larger viewfinder in A6500. The A7 Mark III viewfinder is actually very good, although there are some better viewfinders in some other cameras. The A7 Mark III has 3-inch display, the A6500 has 2.95-inch display. The first difference is that the A7 Mark III display is 4:3 aspect ratio, whereas the A6500 display is 16:9. So on A6500, the whole screen is filled while you are shooting video, and the second huge difference is that the A7 Mark III display does not dim while shooting 4K, unlike the A6500 display. So it is actually usable for shooting video outdoors, which makes a big difference in overall usability. The menu unfortunately wasn't fixed in the new generation of Sony cameras, so A7 Mark III still uses the same 2005 style menu as Sony A6500 without touchscreen functionality. On A7 Mark III the menu contains much more options than in A6500, which is good, but on the other hand it makes the navigation even more difficult. But a huge improvement is the addition of My Menu, where you can put your most frequently used menu items, and that will save you a lot of time. The A6500 unfortunately doesn't have that. Another aspect where A7 Mark III is improvement over A6500 is the battery life. The new NP-FZ100 battery used in A7 Mark III has more than double the capacity of older NP-FW50 batteries used in A6500. If you don't use sunny weather display setting, the A7 Mark III can actually shoot about 3 hours of 4K video on one charge, whereas the A6500 can only shoot about 1 hour and 10 minutes in the same conditions, and that is with a dimmed screen, so that is also a huge improvement. You can also get original battery grip for A7 Mark III. For A6500 you can only get third-party grip. Regarding the overheating, I can only say again that I have never even seen overheating indicator on either of these cameras, not even in the summer, not even on Bali, not anywhere. Although I don't shoot the whole day, like some wedding videographers for example, I only shoot video for like an hour or two, and these are my personal cameras, so I don't intend to make any torture tests, and that is all that I have to say about this topic. And now let's take a look at the image quality. A7 Mark III uses new backside illuminated 24 megapixel full frame sensor, whilst A6500 uses older 24 megapixel sensor without backside illumination. As I've said before, 24 megapixels is the best resolution for me at the moment, since it is way more than enough for publishing stills on vast majority of publishing platforms and even for quite large prints, but at the same time it is not too much for shooting and downsampling full sensor readout video with 6K details. The image quality from A6500 is actually very good. I have always been very happy about the A6500 image quality. It is very solid in low light and the dynamic range is really good as well. But the A7 Mark III sensor is just a beast. It is great in low light and the dynamic range is incredible. Regarding the ISO performance, up to ISO 6400, the A7 Mark III is 1 and a bit stop cleaner than A6500, so ISO 12800 on Sony A7 Mark III is a bit cleaner than ISO 6400 on Sony A6500. ISO 12800 on A6500 is still similar to ISO 25600 on A7 Mark III, so the image doesn't fall apart at ISO 12800 like on Panasonic G9 for example, and even at ISO 25600 there is some color shift and a lot of grain, but for low resolution publishing with a lot of post-processing it could be somewhat usable. A7 Mark III image is clean up to ISO 12800, 25600 is usable for low light with some post-processing, and ISO 51200 is usable with heavy post-processing, but that of course depends on specific scene, and these are very generalized assumptions. Overall, the sensor in A6500 is very good, and the sensor in A7 Mark III is great. It is class above A6500 in every aspect, but it is also worth considering whether you are even shooting in conditions where you would need that kind of performance. But as I have previously said, even if you don't need A7 Mark III capabilities, it will still give you a large margin for errors in case that something goes wrong. The color science has been significantly improved in A7 Mark III. Sony was known to have strange out-of-camera colors in previous cameras, but in my experience that was to a large extent caused by older Sony lenses, which often had that tint. I was actually always quite happy with out-of-camera colors of A6500 when using Sigma 18-35 or 16mm lenses, and I very rarely change colors beside global settings on A6500. Both cameras do have in-body image stabilization, which is great. It helps a lot if you want to use slower shutter speed, and it also helps with jitter while shooting video. The in-body image stabilization in A7 Mark III actually seems to be a bit more effective than A6500 in-body image stabilization, despite that the A7 Mark III has to move around larger sensor. Sony in-body image stabilization can't match stabilization in cameras with smaller sensors, because it is more difficult to move large sensor inside of quite small camera body, but it still makes a huge difference in comparison with having no in-body image stabilization at all. The autofocus is definitely a strength of both cameras, Both use hybrid autofocus system, which is combination of contrast detection autofocus points and phase detection autofocus points. The autofocus in A7 Mark III is carried over from Sony's A9 flagship full-frame camera, so it is extremely fast, reliable, and accurate with incredible tracking capabilities, so it is better than the autofocus in A6500, but you will mostly see the difference only while shooting fast-moving subjects, and I will also test that very soon. The video autofocus is great as well in both. Here the main difference for me is that the autofocus in A7 Mark III is smoother when you are using normal or slow drive speed, but overall I am very happy with Sony A6500's autofocus as well. In 1 year of using A6500, I don't remember any situation where I would have to throw away some footage because of the Sony's hybrid autofocus, except for when I use wrong settings. So overall, the autofocus is great in both A7 Mark III and A6500, but it is a bit better in A7 Mark III, and it is in my opinion the best autofocus on the market at the moment. A7 Mark III can shoot up to 10 frames per second with continuous autofocus and mechanical shutter, which is more than enough for me. A6500 can shoot up to 11 frames per second with continuous autofocus and also mechanical shutter, so 1 frame per second more. Not that long ago, only flagships could do that, so that in combination with very good autofocus makes both A7 Mark III and A6500 very suitable for sports and wildlife as well. Both also have great buffer. A6500 can shoot about 110 RAWs until the buffer is full, and A7 Mark III can shoot about 40 uncompressed RAW or 120 compressed RAWs. A7 Mark III has also 2 card slots, one of which is UHS 2 compatible, whereas the A6500 only has one UHS 1 compatible card slot, so if you want that extra peace of mind that you have backup in case that the SD card would fail, only A7 Mark III can give you that. Regarding the video, both cameras can shoot full sensor readout 6K video and downsample that to 4K when shooting 24 or 25 frames per second, which means that you basically have 4K video with 6K details, so it gives you the best video quality on the market in terms of sharpness. The codec is very solid in my opinion for 8-bit footage. There is no 10-bit video in either, but Sony has great picture profiles for color grading. You have the S-Log2, S-Log3, Cine4 and hybrid log gamma in A7 Mark III. You can customize everything according to your needs and you can capture a lot of dynamic range with these profiles. And for me, these picture profiles make up a lot for the absence of 10-bit video. Neither can shoot 4K 60p, but both can shoot proper 120 frames per second 1080p. I personally prefer 120 frames per second 1080p over 60p 4K, but that is a matter of preference. 1080p quality is better in A7 Mark III, but with both you need to find proper sharpening settings in post or in camera, because Sony is quite conservative with in-camera sharpening in 1080p video. Unfortunately, the rolling shutter is quite significant with both. It is a lot better with A7 Mark III, but it is still there. With A7 Mark III, it is in my opinion acceptable for something like vlogging. For narrative work, I would still use rolling shutter repair in Premiere Pro, which completely fixes this issue, but it will significantly increase exporting time. In A6500, the rolling shutter is pretty bad, so I do apply rolling shutter repair to every A6500 clip with faster movement. The lens selection for A7 Mark III and A6500 is also very different, especially if you really want an excellent image quality. The Sigma 18-35 and 50-100mm f1.8 art lenses that you can use on A6500 with an adapter are the only 2 zoom lenses for crop sensors that can fully utilize the sensor in A6500. Other than those, you need to use primes to get excellent results, whereas there is a wide variety of zoom and prime full frame lenses for A7 Mark III, and since the A7 Mark III has lower pixel density, it is much less demanding on the lens sharpness. You can of course use full frame lenses with A6500, but there is the crop of course, and some other things that need to be considered, and I will talk about those in separate video. To sum up, I have to say that the A7 Mark III is better than A6500 in every aspect except for the portability and the price. In some areas the improvement is huge, like the ISO performance, handling or battery. In other areas the improvement is smaller, like with the in-body image stabilization. The performance of A6500 in terms of the results that it can provide is already great, and the A7 Mark III takes it to the next level while fixing most of A6500 annoyances like the 4K screen dim, poor battery life and so on, which is why the A7 Mark III is a significant upgrade over A6500. The price is also a factor here, since the A6500 costs much less and it will still provide great results. If the A7 Mark III is too much for your budget, I generally still recommend A6500, although if you ask me whether the A7 Mark III is worth the extra money, my honest opinion is that yes it is. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.